Hello and welcome to everyone. We've got just a few more seconds here before it hits 10:30, and I just posted into the chat that I'm making a request that people put the code for their chapter at the end of their name. I like to see what state people are from and what area. Okay, it is now 10:30. Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Cities track. You are in the first session, Building Car Optional Cities, with our keynote speaker, Victor Dover. I'm Lisa Ruckman of the Space Coast chapter near Cape Canaveral, Florida. We will have time for questions at the end of the talk. We're asking that you type your questions into the chat, looks like it's not up yet. Daryl is hopefully going to be renaming himself to Ask Daryl so that you can see specifically who. Otherwise, just send it in there and we'll forward it correctly. Our speaker, Victor Dover's work has been featured on TV, radio, and in every major textbook on city planning published in the last decade. He's a co-founder of the award-winning town planning and urban design firm, Dover Cole & Partners, and they've helped shape the future of towns and cities in 24 states and 5 continents. A tireless reformer, he helped set the standards for green building at the neighborhood scale, co-founded the Form-Based Codes Institute, and helped set the curriculum for citizen participation in city planning. Take it away, Victor.
Well, good morning, everyone. I don't have good words to describe how honored I am actually to speak to this group. I think we're in a very interesting and fraught moment in our history between the pandemic and the protests and the politics and all the things that are going on, sweeping us along in change and probably also inducing some anxieties. And I want to talk to you about the near future. And in a way, the urbanism of 2021 through 2035, let's say. Not the distant future, the near future. But the great thing about a fraught moment like the one we're in is when we get out of the other end of this pipeline of change, we have a chance to make a world that's a lot better than the one that we have. So I want to talk a little bit about that and why I think it matters to members of the Citizens Climate Lobby. Now, I'm going to talk about design, but I'm not going to talk about the giant unbreakable glass, plastic, and metal atomic-powered city of the future where we're all going to live under domes and have nuclear cars and that kind of thing. I'm a futurist, but I want to talk to you about a future that is a lot more doable and a lot more close up and maybe a lot more familiar than the one we're used to seeing from science fiction. In our firm, we have a very interesting practice because we get to travel all over the place and help communities decide what they want to be when they grow up. So we kind of like to say we're in the before and after business, helping people realize what a great shared resource their cities and their city streets and public spaces are, and how that shared resource can be central to generating more human happiness and doing right by our habitat. So a lot of what we are asked to work on is in this before and after business is helping people visualize how they might change the place that they've inherited into some place they could love more. So we do a lot of drawings, we make a lot of pictures, we do a lot of documentation of the way things are. I remember Sears, remember the Sears Auto Center and the big parking lot around the mall where those were. This is the city of the recent past, which turned out to be a pretty temporary and brittle economic prospect, a pretty coarse-grained way of doing human settlement. And we help people visualize how land can be recycled, how communities can be revitalized, how change can make things better rather than worse, and also build on the resilience that comes from small is beautiful approach, from having it matter more what kind of relationship you develop with that place and those addresses than, say, the land uses inside the buildings, as temporary as they may be. And in our own practice with 22 people, I've learned to listen to the young people in our office, to take cues from them about where the world is going and what kind of world they would like to create. And one interesting thing to watch over the last few years is how one by one, we started having more and more and more of our staff arrive in our little office in downtown South Miami on 2 wheels or 2 feet or via transit. instead of hassling with driving in traffic or hassling with parking. So this is the executive parking lot at our office. If you arrive at work on your bike, you get the best parking space in the place. And so the relevance of this for our climate discussion is that so much of our carbon footprint problem is related to transportation. And while some of that is freight, moving about, and some of that is long distance air travel, of course, a lot of it has to do with the little trips we make during the day, going to and from our daily errands and work. With the average household in the suburbs generating between 10 and 14 car trips per day per household, which have trended toward getting longer and longer, we make maybe 4 or 5 trips that are per household that are attributable to commutes to work, but a lot of other trips that the transportation engineers call discretionary trips. And those are the trips to get an ice cream cone or an egg McMuffin or take a kid to piano lessons and that kind of thing. And all of those trips and all of those miles and all the emissions that come out of the tailpipes when we make those trips really add up. So we began to think a lot about what we might do to cities to address that directly. The first thing is to realize that many of the bad habits and some of the bad regulations, including zoning, have tended to try and minimize the impacts of one land use upon another by pushing things farther apart. Make your lots bigger, require bigger minimum lot size, a deeper buffer or setback or distance between the nearest other thing, whether it's another house or a place to work or a place to get that ice cream cone. So pushing us farther apart actually has this perverse reverse effect from what it's intended. It's intended to minimize the impacts on things, but what it does actually is just maximize driving, because when we push things farther and farther apart, we make it almost mandatory that people will make a car trip, often a single occupant car trip for everything they need every time. Now, on the other hand, traditionally cities were about deliberately and consciously and by design bringing us closer together. The classic traditional neighborhoods of our human settlements for about 3,500 years of human experience in building these places were all about coming closer together for our convenience and for commerce and for security and for the reason that we're social beings and we like to be with one another and exchange ideas and make economic exchanges, social exchanges. So we have to figure out how to get back in the habit of deliberately bringing things closer together. And the environmental impact should be obvious from a picture like this one, because we'll need less of the land to accommodate our growth. We'll be able to preserve more of the land in total for other things like restoration of wilderness and for growing food. So if you get in a helicopter and you fly at pretty high altitude and look down at the way America looks, this is what we've gradually been transforming the continent to resemble. Lisa, this is not too terribly far from where you live. This is in the center of the state, due west of you in Altamont Springs. And that's the Altamont Mall in the center right of the top half of the picture. And of course, here we have all the land uses that make a city, places to shop, places to work, places to live in houses, places to live in housing, places of worship, places to get something to eat, all of those things. And they're all arrayed on land parcels as if each parcel was its own individual asteroid. And so, of course, we think that that's in order to keep them from mixing together in a way that would be toxic or noxious. Just like 100 years ago, people were very focused on getting us out of the smoky industrial cities because of the toxic effects on our households of living so close to smokestack industry. But here, the unintended consequence is all of the negative impact we have on one another when we try to move from one of these land uses to the other. We all go out into the same roads and the same intersections during the same peak hour, and then we wonder, why is there all this traffic? It's because of the way the city is configured. So our city of the near future has to be better than these dumb zoning maps we used to produce back in the middle of the 20th century, where we were painting colors of red for highway commercial and colors of yellow for low density residential and so on. And think again about how to do that growing together of things. So we do a lot of illustrations to get people thinking about this. in all the different ways that the benefits are interrelated. For example, if you have an unaffordable housing crisis, you probably also have a related transportation menu crisis where the cost of moving around is so great that part of your household budget you could use to deal with the rising housing costs is not available to you to do that. And of course, there are all kinds of descending consequences from that. Now, the good news is that changing this up is not something that we have to scratch our heads wondering if the market would support. National Association of Realtors and the National Association of Home Builders, very conservative organizations, routinely poll, and their surveys suggest that big percentages of people would be willing to pay even more than they already pay in order to get to a walkable community within walking distance between their home and parks, shops, and restaurants. 17% even willingly suggest they'd be willing to pay a lot more. And so, some of the reasons why might be kind of obvious. I talked about social and economic exchanges. Well, here are some people on a sidewalk on a pretty busy street a block from the BBC headquarters in London, and they're exchanging ideas. They may be talking about where to go for lunch, or they may be talking about a new deal or whatever they're doing. But I can't help but notice that they are just inches away from the curb, right where motor vehicles are likely to turn the corner and drive across that crosswalk. And yet the design is such that there's such a narrow pavement, there's a texture on the road, the crosswalk itself has been lifted up to be flush with the sidewalk, indicating that the pedestrians have priority here. And if you come around that corner, you're expected to move about in a way that is safe for the pedestrians. When we bring things closer together, we get convenience. And I don't have to tell the people from Brooklyn this, but I'm talking to the Southeast Climate Conference, right? And I think we forget that our traditional cities had this amazing convenience that comes from bringing things closer together. Picture on the right is one I shot in Bologna. And on that intersection in Bologna, just a few steps from the apartments you can see above shops across the street, there's been a fresh fruit and vegetable vendor on that corner for several hundred years. And people come out of that apartment and they walk down their block and they can get fresh and healthy food. And they also interact with the person that they're buying it from. And there's a kind of sociability that goes with that is really hard to put a price on, not to mention the environmental efficiency of doing that. Actually, we're used to hearing that denser cities and smart growth cities will be better for our carbon footprint. But there's some interesting other details that are less well known. Like, for example, the LoTAC report many years ago found that if you can get to enough choice in the range of storefront businesses like retail and restaurants that are within walking distance of your household, your carbon footprint can drop like a rock, because you'll be enticed to walk over there or take a short bike ride and leave your car keys in your pocket if you own a car at all. So lowering the driving drops our carbon footprint. There's another slew of factors that are reasons why we should do this anyway. Some of you have probably heard about the work of Susan Pinker. She's a psychologist who reports on a large-scale study, thousands and thousands of people who were interviewed in detail about their lives. And asked them all kinds of questions about what they do and so on. And then they stored that information away, waited 10 years, and then they went back to see who was still breathing. And the results are very interesting. Some of you might expect the people who were still alive are the ones who had a daily exercise regimen, or they had taken their blood pressure medicine or stopped smoking. But other things are really surprising. Like the top two here are about our human-human relationships. And close relationships are a really big one here, but look, even bigger in your likelihood of staying alive is social integration. Susan talks about how that means interacting with people you may not even know by name, but you see from time to time, including just the face-to-face contact with strangers. Now, we know that correlation is not causation. We can't help noticing that cities where people deliberately come to know their neighbors and or have contact with others who may not look exactly like them or do the same thing that they do in their daily work is a big factor for longevity and happiness. There are some other reasons, for example, just helping people save money. This is a map of El Paso showing their trunk line BRT routes. We found years ago that people could save a lot of money and already were saving a lot of money if they were lucky enough to live near transit. which makes it kind of important to notice that transit spending is constantly in peril. You know, the support of transit from our public purse is something that is especially crucial right now. Transit has lost a lot of ridership during the pandemic. We need to keep those transit agencies vital and alive and ready to not just keep working, but to expand when the pandemic is over. And that means spending money on it so that the households don't have to spend money on all those cars. There's an old story about how cities should be demonized for all the things that they do to the environment, like all that asphalt and all that urban heat island effect. But I love the chart on the left because it really shows is that the places where per household and per person we're generating the most CO2 are the suburbs, where the trips are longer because of all that pushing of things apart. On the city, on the other hand, there's kind of built-in efficiency that goes from people using car share and taxis and transit, and from people walking and biking to their daily destinations. So when we bring people close together, this chart won't surprise you. That same report found that there's just a steady decrease in the typical carbon footprint as the density and intensity of development goes up. But that means we have to figure out how to design it. And I'm going to talk about how we have 3,500 years of experience doing this. I believe that the textbook on how we should design places so that people are happy and supported and nurtured by their higher density and higher intensity neighborhoods is right there in our built environment. The textbook is the precedent of our histories of traditional neighborhoods. This is a street in Buenos Aires where the nearby houses do not have big private yards or deep front yards and big green spaces and public spaces, private spaces in their lots. But they have generous public spaces like here where the street itself is a place for gathering, for play, and for moving about in fresh air and sunshine. So our textbook, our inheritance of precedents, tells us that if we get the building to street relationships right, we'll create a place where people want to be, and we can do more with the land. Now, the hipsters and the millennials have long since figured that out, of course, which is why I made the wisecrack earlier about Brooklyn, or I could say the same thing about the Strip in Pittsburgh. The places where people want to be tend not to be the ones with deep front yards and big setbacks. They tend to be the places where it's more like a village. And that's not unique to Pittsburgh or Brooklyn. That's something that we can see in every geographic location and every climate zone. Here a picture from Asia to make the point. Now, what really matters is the space between the buildings. And that's ironic, given all the attention that's given to architecture. I may get drummed out of the architecture fraternity for making this comment. But actually, as important as architecture is, and I'll talk more about that in a second, I think it's important to realize that the design of the space between the buildings is even more important. Like here, for example, if our wildlife biologist were to go out and try and do observations in the wild of the dominant species in this location, he would, or she would probably come to the conclusion that that dominant species is made of fiberglass and steel, petroleum, and rubber. On the other hand, if they're reading all the signals and signs, they might say, oh, look, if we wait here long enough, we'll see one or two of these observed in the wild in this location. And it's true, they probably could walk. Humans could walk here because there's this perfunctory little sidewalk in the lower right-hand corner. But would you really want to? Are you really likely to? Probably not in a public realm that looks like this. Now, what about a public realm that looks like this one? This is a street in Paris. It's not a particularly tourist-dominated street. It's a pretty ordinary street in Paris. And by Parisian standards, these are pretty ordinary buildings, which says a lot. But and most of the sidewalk spaces here are just mere asphalt, sometimes painted with a painted crosswalk. It's not fancy materials that makes this a place where people want to be. It's the building-to-street relationships, the proportions of the public space, and the sense that, well, we're creating human habitat instead of just car habitat. What about on a leafy, green, tree-lined suburban street? This historic street in Port Royal, South Carolina kind of tells the story. Here's a sidewalk where you probably are likely to walk. And that's because those front porches within walking, conversation distance of the person walking by make the whole thing pretty comfortable. Now, this historic street is not really historic. It's actually only about 20 years old. those houses were newly constructed. They just used the textbook that I'm talking about, the generous precedents that have been left behind for us in traditional cities. Just for comparison, let's look at this one. Here's throwing the precedent textbook and the how-to manual created by traditional architecture and urbanism out the window, and you get something very different, right? These look very different, I'm sure. Just comparing the two pictures, here's the one with the front porches, or the one with the garage doors on the front. The bad news here is that these two places are exactly the same. At least if we were looking at one of those color-coded future land use maps, they'd be exactly the same, because they're single-family detached residential development at a certain number, a certain density of dwelling units per acre, certain lot size, certain lot width. Those are all the same between these two scenes. Of course, one has alleys, so you don't see a bunch of driveways and garage doors. One doesn't, and it has enshrined on the front of the building. The message that they want to send to future generations is that cars live here. So design makes a huge, huge difference. And that includes how we modify the design over time in the cities we've inherited. Look at the picture at the bottom. This is Lexington Avenue during the construction of the Lex Line subway. So you can see some planks where the sidewalk goes. The busiest transit line in the world. And back when this photograph was made, look at the proportion of the space that was devoted to streetcars, Model Ts, and horses and buggies in the center of the right-of-way. And then the sidewalks, these beautiful brownstones of the New York kind. I like the English basement here, which lets some daylight run into the lower floors of this building. The picture on the top, 100 years later, is shot from the same place. And in fact, these are, for the most part, the same buildings. But look how much of the space has now been devoted to storing and moving cars. And they, to make room to move the sidewalk out of the way and push the pedestrians to the fringe, they filled in that daylight basement. They even invented some sort of saw for slicing off all of that exquisite architectural detail that these buildings used to have. And so this tells us that even in our greenest, densest, most walkable city, we still have a long way to go on recovering what we learned from the textbook. On the subject of streets, let's think about how they are as shared spaces. This is an old picture of Broadway near Herald Square. In fact, in the distance, you can see the Times Tower. That's the building where they dropped the ball on New Year's Eve at Times Square in the distance. This picture was made back when, the New York Herald building was like an Italian palazzo. That's how much we revered journalists at that time. But in the street of the picture, you can see people walking about. You can see people on bikes. You can see people on horseback and horses and buggies. You can see some Tin Lizzies, Model Ts, and cable cars. This time, Broadway had cables under the street. And what's interesting is no traffic signals, no markings, no signs or of any kind, no crosswalks. Pedestrians are all crossing wherever they want, and they're out in the middle of the street. In fact, they wait out in the center of the street for the cable car they're going for, and that's because when this photograph was made, the vehicles were moving slowly, and I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. Now, after everything sped up, and we also went all scientific about how we make our cities, we started giving every expert everything they wanted, including the utilities and the garbage trucks and of course, the cars and their parking, the fire trucks, and everything else. And here's a street that's completely legal and standard from anywhere, Texas, USA, just showing what happens when we forget about that idea of the street as a shared space and start thinking of it as all vehicular space. It's not necessary for us to do that. In fact, gradually the lessons of the past are being recovered. Here's a new street in Davidson, North Carolina, two-way travel that's designed as a yield street or a give-way street where if two cars come toward one another in opposite directions, one of them will tuck behind the other, pass, probably wave at their neighbor, and then move along, all doing so very slowly by design. So that obsession with speed has really backfired on us. Rethinking it and becoming obsessed with safety instead can bring us a lot of benefits in the neighborhoods of the near future. Let's consider the comfort and safety of the individual shown in the middle of this picture. Here, a street and this is in Charleston, South Carolina, it was created when they thought that wider and faster roads were better roads. And this is the environment that they created And of course, they made it pretty inevitable that although a few people would still try to move about on 2 feet or in a wheelchair or on 2 wheels on a bike, they do so at their peril, and they're made to feel like they're doing it wrong. Probably a little sunburned, a little embarrassed, maybe bored, certainly unsafe, and unlikely to feel glad about having done so. Now, we work with big audiences, and so I often pass out keypad polling devices or ask people to respond to surveys via their smartphone. And one of the questions we love to ask is, do you remember when you were a kid, did your parents talk to you about how they used to walk to school? Audiences like the one we have here this morning probably remember their parents saying they did exactly that in large numbers. And then the next question I'll ask is, what about yourself? Do you remember walking to school, or did you walk or bike to school for some part of your years before you went off to college or what have you? And a lot of people, just a who've been out of school just a generation or so, will remember doing the same thing, maybe not in quite the same quantity as their parents. And then I ask, what about the kids in your family now, or your grandkids, or the kids in your neighborhood? You walk or bike to school? And I almost always get a response like this. Now, that's not to suggest that walking to school or safe routes to school or even neighborhood schools is the be-all, end-all of successful urbanism, but it's pretty important to notice how dramatically things changed when we forgot how to design streets. So I'm going to mention 5 basic characteristics of good street designs that play into how we make the streets in a car-optional neighborhood. These are all things you can ask for. The first one is that the streets where people want to be as people habitat have a shape. They will tend to have defined through buildings or landscape a kind of proportional relationship from the height of the things on the side, like buildings and trees, that are making the enclosure to the width between those things. And when the height to width ratio is reasonably comfortable, property values rise, people like to be in that space. When the height to width ratio gets too wide and the things are spread too far apart, the sense of place dissipates, property value drops. Now, remember the young lady in the yellow top on the bike in the picture of Amsterdam down below. I'm going to come back to her in a minute. Now, we're used to thinking about this idea of the street as a space with a shape where the buildings are the walls and the carriageway and the sidewalks are the floor when we think about downtowns. This is downtown Portland, for example. But that idea of the proportional relationship, building height to street width, what we call spatial enclosure, that idea also plays out in our small towns. So here's a 2-story building really having the same effect and creating some of those same building to street relationships. Second, the streets where people want to be are comfortable, and that has a lot to do with climate. For example, deciduous trees that grow leaves in the summer and filter the sunlight and make it shadier for you to walk along, lower the cooling costs inside those buildings, and lower the carbon footprint in the process, are part of the design. And in the winter, they lose their leaves, they let the sun come in at its lower angle and melt the ice on the sidewalk and warm the interiors of those buildings. And in hot, sticky climates, there's another version of the same thing, where using architecture and landscape, we can make the place comfortable. Well, so what do you think about this picture? Comfortable? Do you think the fellow in the white t-shirt is comfortable in this space? I would argue not, and it's because of the design of the space itself. Next, the streets where people want to be in successful cities worth recycling and regrowing are connected. They go somewhere. They go from where you want to be to where from where you are to where you want to be. And for those who wonder about this, let me just say, in short, two-lane roads carry a lot more traffic than one 4-lane road. So if you're wondering whether this idea of a connected web of streets versus big, fat, wide, fast roads is going to hurt your ability to move around or hurt the efficiency and capacity of our traffic system, don't worry about it. A connected system has a lot more power to satisfy the demands for travel than a disconnected one. And guess what? That same study I showed you before showed that when we have more intersections, more links and nodes, smaller blocks, the city is more like a web and less like a tree, then our driving goes down, our carbon footprint drops dramatically, just like it did with density or mixed use. Fourth, the cities where people want to be and the streets in them are safe. So the obsession over safety is crucial. It means you have to think that's the #1 priority, not necessarily getting somewhere a few seconds faster. A little bit of increase in speed greatly increases the likelihood of fatality when one of our motor vehicles collides with one of our squishy carbon-based traffic calming devices called people. And so at 20 miles an hour, every once in a while, 1 out of 20, there will be a fatality. But just at 30 or 40 miles an hour, a little bit more speed, there's a huge fatality rate as a result of speed. So we need to redesign streets for slower speeds within our walkable communities. Put the safety as the top priority. Well, protecting the public health, safety, and welfare, that's a phrase straight out of the Constitution. It's the basis of our police power, our authority to regulate, including zoning. So what do you think? Here's some public health workers, and I don't think their safety and welfare has really been considered when they have to make this crossing of that street at their shift change. Or consider what happens at the typical intersection. For Greg Hammer's sake, I've included a picture of Coral Gables at a familiar spot you'll recognize. You'll see that hapless cyclist we just saw and the one who's crossing here now, they all had the green. This was during the time when the little white walking man indicator on the pedestrian signal at the crosswalk showed the pedestrians, and the cyclists had the right of way, and look what they have to go through to deal with that experience. Or consider this guy. Dr. Dick Jackson would say that this fellow is likely to end up in an emergency room later today and be diagnosed with heat stroke or dehydration, something like that. It really has is street tree deficiency syndrome. Now I'll just compare that to the situation in a neighborhood in London here. This is 7 Dials, where there are lorries making deliveries and there are people swirling around. There's car traffic moving through the space, but the humans dominate and they set the pace. And they walk across the street in whatever angle they like, whenever they like, and sit on the monument and watch the valet of the sidewalk go on around them. Last, the places where people want to be are memorable. They have human creativity on display, and that could come from beautiful signage, it could come from great art, official or unofficial, it could come from good architecture. But the point is, human creativity is one of the reasons we go out into the world and see what our neighbors have made. And so the world over, the places where it's exciting to be in the street because of the way human creativity is on display are the places where it's memorable. And we crave that. So if you want to make your community competitive, even while making it denser and draw people in and make the sale, and also make them happy, make them memorable. Now, I always get the question, where can we do this, Victor? Where's there room for this? Our community is already built out. I mean, we have a Starbucks here and a CVS there and the houses on the cul-de-sac. We don't really have any room. And the answer is, well, this is the Kmart, for example, or at least it used to be. Now it's the empty Kmart where the Kmart used to be. And a bankrupt supermarket chain where a thriving one used to be. We have a lot of land in our cities that is actually not the beloved or fiercely protected part. You know, the folks over here in the cul-de-sac in the upper right-hand corner, they really don't want you coming into their neighborhood, charging in and saying, let's change it up, let's redo all this. But they probably don't love the arterial corridor, the strip commercial area, and they probably just as soon you figured out how to make one of those communities of the future there instead of where they have their house. And so there's actually a lot of room to grow new neighborhoods that have the characteristics I've been describing. When we do that, amazing things can happen as we begin to shift from putting all our emphasis on car convenience to walking, biking, and transit. You notice that there are no high-rise buildings in the city scene here. This is Groningen for those who don't recognize this spot in the Netherlands. And it's just interesting to see that people come out. Here's us at twilight on a regular weekday, just moving about their lives, and not many of them doing so with single occupant car trips. Now, right about this point in any presentation, I can count on someone saying, but Victor, this is not Amsterdam. We're not Amsterdam. We can't be like that. So I'll have a couple of thoughts for you on that. First of all, remember the Amsterdam or the Groningen that I just showed you, we're not Amsterdam or Groningen just a short time ago. In fact, the Dutch have always been famous for cycling. In the 1970s, were jamming their streets with cars, and their cycling was at an all-time low. And this is a scene in Amsterdam from the early 1970s. They actually made a cultural decision to change up the way they were going to build and rebuild their city. They actually abandoned a model that was being sold to them by Detroit and said, why don't we be Amsterdam instead? And that has worked out terribly well. Now, on the other hand, other folks will know about the success stories in New York, especially during the Bloomberg administration, where they made a lot of changes in the street and successfully took back a lot of space that was devoted to swirling vehicles and asphalt and made it people space again. And they'll say, well, we're not New York, we can't do that. And I will tell you, a lot of what New York did, they did overnight by using pilot projects. Jeanette Sadik-Khan was the transportation commissioner, used the vast power of her office to send her crew out in the middle of the night, paint some epoxy on the street, bring out some potted plants and a few extra boulders, some movable tables and chairs, and they took back these spaces. And the next morning, New Yorkers would stream out of their upstairs buildings and out into those public spaces and into those movable tables and chairs, knowing exactly what to do. So in short, people like this stuff, and if you give them more of it, they will lap it up and they will ask you where they can go find more of it. In fact, it's the most important factor on deciding where to live, according to the surveys done by the business people, not by the artists or the urbanists. So what's in this car optional neighborhood? In the last few seconds here, I'm just going to give you the recipe. 10 things, and I'll flash this again momentarily so you can see it, but there are 10 things I will bet you'll find. And to illustrate the point, I'll show you pictures from the Bend in Chattanooga, which is a new neighborhood in the making there, where the old factory space is being remade into Chattanooga's first 21st century car optional neighborhood. First things first, bringing stuff closer together, getting that practicality from mixed use, doing so in town, giving people a chance to find things within walking distance, giving them livable streets and housing variety along with places to work so that they can live their life car light, if not car free. Part of that is remembering how to put things closer together. We used to do so all the time. Here's a zero-step entrance house. Grandmother lives there, very small footprint. Here's a conventional house in the center with a little more space, growing family inside there. And then on the right is one that has fancy architecture, bigger square footage and more appointments. And they're all right together on the same street, on the same block in Buffalo. I'm talking about something Dan Perolik calls missing middle housing, which means doing all those things other than just the single family detached house on a large lot or the big condo and a mid-rise or high-rise. Things like duplexes and triplexes and courtyard apartments and row houses and live work units. That variety is coming back in a big way. So, for example, lowering the per unit land cost by attaching houses again, as we did during the high point in American city building, and mixing workplaces in small and gentle ways with places to live. What about the humble accessory dwelling units or granny flats, the so-called in-laws quarters that once were common and have in many of our communities been outlawed? And to be more ambitious, what about thinking about places where we need healthcare or assisted living, but doing it where we are also providing places for the independent living households and caregivers to live in the same neighborhood, instead of expecting our nurses or caregivers to travel long distances in their expensive car so they can go far enough away to get a house that they can afford. Why aren't we asking our caregiving complexes to provide housing for those receiving care and also those who are giving it? Second, we look for highly walkable, bikable streets. This is the main street in Chattanooga. It's called Main Street. Runs through the south side of the successfully revitalized area, and it will reach the river along the route I'm showing you here next to some new office buildings. So, there's no question here that if you're wanting to bike, you could feel safe and comfortable doing so, even at all ages and abilities. Third, small blocks, an interconnected web pattern. This is the Bend from up above, and you can see how, generally speaking, buildings hug the edges of the blocks and they're relatively small, so you can walk around. And that means integrating the grid of streets into the network of its surroundings. So in the case of the Bend, picking up on the historic block pattern and extending it to the river. I think this may be the most important one, and I'll just give you the end of the formula here, Lisa. The street-oriented architecture and public spaces where people are comfortable being. And that means actually designing buildings with doors and windows facing the street, balconies and storefronts, not blank walls, not parking decks. That is how we get people out on foot and make them comfortable in these spaces. And so Lisa, I'm just going to advance to the end of the formula and also paste it in the chat. You have to think about all the new technology. That's helpful. It's not the answer to the problem. The answer to the problem is finding ways to move fewer miles and still have a great quality of life. The answer isn't finding ways to pack our cities with more parking and think about how we use all that space when we don't need as much of it because of the change to car optional neighborhoods and money that we can save as a result of doing that. Then,
okay, well, we're actually out of time at this point.
Yeah. So I'm going to post the list into the chat, and I look forward to hearing any feedback that you have.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing the information. We appreciate you taking the time to join us at the conference. Thanks to everyone here that's participating. Coming up next on the Sustainable Cities track is creating sustainable cities, minimizing the urban carbon footprint. The next session starts at 11:15, so we just have a few minutes. If you'd like to stay here, I'm gonna let Victor continue to, maybe answer a question or two really quick. Maybe he can post in the chat if there's any resources or anything that we can go to. Thank you.
Will do. What sort of questions have come up so far, Lisa?
Well, what I've seen so far is things like the McMansion developments and what is it that we can do to encourage the cities, to be more open to these types of developments and discouraging them from doing the McMansion developments.
Right, sure. One of the ironies of land development regulation is that a lot of cities set their zoning up so they require low density, basically mandate maximum residential density for vast areas of their town, thinking that they're helping to guarantee the results, when in fact, they're beneficial at protecting property values. They are probably having the exact opposite effect, especially in the coming generation. Given what's going on in our demographic pipeline and the aging of the baby boomer generation, Chris Nelson from the University of Arizona predicts that by 2045, we'll have something like 40 million surplus single-family detached houses. So actually telling your real estate developers that that's the only thing you'll accept and that's the only thing you'll have more of is a really odd thing to do. You're maybe actually sentencing a lot of households to an asset that they won't be able to dispose of. So we're going to get more creative about reusing those in the future as well, and certainly not overdoing it on building more of them.
There's also been some questions about retrofitting. You showed the picture of the suburbs where people aren't going to want to have their lots taken over, but if a neighborhood agrees, to make some changes, are there retrofitting ideas?
Of course. And so I just like to think that most of the retrofitting can occur on the parts of your community that are the least beloved. That strip shopping center is an example that I showed, the dead mall, we all have them. In every major metropolitan region, there's at least one, and there may be several dead or dying shopping malls. Those are vast territories of land in which a lot of growth and change can be accommodated without disturbing people. In the more sensitive areas where you're not trying, you might be concerned about displacement. When higher income people come crushing into the scarce resource of the charming historic neighborhood, you might be concerned about upsetting the apple cart. Those, even if it's just the giving the ability of that small parcel near your homes, where they're allowed to have a 7-Eleven in a one-story building with a parking lot in the front, but they're not allowed to have a studio apartment upstairs where somebody who works there could live, or they're not allowed to have a yoga studio on the second floor. Fixing those things in the zoning is really the key to it. And it's The biggest retrofit difficulty is in rebuilding the streets themselves. So that's why I spent the time on streets. I think getting street design right is the one thing that government must lead on. It's the thing you can least afford to get right. It's gotten wrong most often. So we really don't have the luxury to just continually reconstruct the streets like it might have been done in previous decades with, you know, flowing gas tax money and so on, as those resources are trying out. So that means getting street design a special focus and planting street trees. If you're in your suburb, you're wondering where can you start? What can you say to your mayor that they'll understand right away? Tell them plant street trees. Plant some more street trees after that. It's the most important thing you can do, the simplest and the fastest, that start to be a demand generator for all the other changes. Maybe, Lisa, the street tree, the humble street tree, is a gateway drug towards the livable community.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's 11:15. I'm going to turn this over to the next session.